In the history of any nation, civilization, or even a city, there are focal points, moments woven into the fabric of time, knots in the branch that direct the path of growth. The city of Darwin is no different when it comes to focal points. One such moment ingrained into the minds of citizens across Darwin is the 19th of February, 1942. A moment of great devastation as the city was bombed by the Japanese forces. It has been marked by numerous plaques, monuments, and even works of artistry. And this video is going to give you a rough idea as to what happened on that fateful day in 1942. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video, and let's get straight into it with a little bit of context. In the late 19th century, the Japanese were somewhat forced into modernity thanks to the arrival of an American junk ship in 1868. And from the very earliest moments of the 20th century, the Japanese began their imperialistic march on Asia, beginning firstly with parts of Soviet Russia in 1905, the Korean Peninsula in 1910, and then kicking up a notch in the 1930s, firstly with the Manchurian crisis of 31-32, and then a wider Indo-Japanese war which began in 1937. Seeing this Japanese expansionism, the Australians largely believed that, well, nothing would really happen. The strong trading partnerships between the two nations was good enough to prevent and defend them from any such attack by the Japanese on Australian shores. But by the 1930s, Australians, and especially those in government, began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, something may indeed happen, and an attack may occur by the Japanese. The most prolific of these critical voices was a man by the name of John Curtin. Now, he was the leader of the opposition to that of the Australian government between 1935 and 1941. So he acted as the sort of counterbalance to that of the Australian government in the democratic system. Now, Curtin believed in self-reliance, and he advocated this greatly. And when the Second World War started in 1939, he was very critical of leaving Australia undefended by sending the Australian troops over to Europe. Curtin would go on to become the Prime Minister of Australia on the 7th of October 1941. In 1923, the British government, supported alongside the Australians, agreed that Singapore should become the main base of operations serving the British interests in the South Asian Pacific. This was known as the Singapore Strategy. Rather obvious name, perhaps. The city of Darwin was to serve as the number 2 base, the backup to this Singapore strategy. But the problem is that the Australians believed that this Singapore base was a mere comfort blanket, and that should the time come, Singapore would actually fall and reinforcements would not arrive quick enough. As a result of this comfort blanket offered up by the British, the Australian government decided to plough a lot of money into the city of Darwin and into its defensive capabilities. The first of the defensive, well, more of a contingency in this case, was the construction of oil tanks across the Darwin area. 11 were constructed between 1926 and 1941. Proper coastal fortifications and guns were constructed in 1932, and a proper military presence within Darwin began by 1933-34. Military personnel topped roughly 7,000 by mid-1941 and roughly 10,000 by February of 1942. Trenches, gun pits and barbed wire were set along the coastline of Darwin so that they would be guard installations, strong points, where the military personnel stationed in Darwin could fight to the last man if ever there was an attack on Australian shores. The concept of a boom net was devised in 1937 and spread across the east and west points of the Darwin harbour by 1940. Now, what a boom net is an anti-submarine system with a small gap within the net so that passing ships can actually get in to the Darwin harbour. So it means that if anyone was trying to attack, there's only a very narrow strip in which to avoid any booms. All this money that was being largely spent on defence brought about a new prosperity to the city of Darwin. Everybody who was eligible to have a job, they did have a job. And as a result of this prosperity, hundreds, if not thousands of people were travelling through Australia to experience this new wealth and prosperity that Darwin could offer. The defensive capabilities by the Australians are all very well and good, but they were under the basis that the Japanese were going to attack by land or by sea. No real consideration had been given to a potential aerial assault like what had happened at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had proven themselves keenly effective when it came to naval aviation, thanks to the guidance of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and Commander Mitsuo Fushida, who were both primaries and effective planners in the attacks on both Pearl Harbor and Darwin. The Japanese Zeros were the fastest aircraft in the world at that time, with the pilots being extremely well trained and very experienced. Now, comparing that to the American Kitty Hawks, there are pros and cons either way. The Kitty Hawks were big, they were strong in armour, and they had heavy guns. But they lacked the manoeuvrability to keep up with the Japanese Zeros. And what's more, the aviators that were piloting the Kitty Hawks had less experience and less training than that of the Japanese. But the Kitty Hawk should not be so easily dismissed. You see, on the 15th of February 1942, Lieutenant Robert J. Buell responded to an Allied convoy being attacked by the Japanese. He was the first out of only 2 available aircraft to make it to the convoy and defend it. He shot down a bomber and made a clear path so that the Allied convoy could make its escape. Sadly though, Buell's own aircraft was shot down and he sadly died in the crash. But his service and sacrifice are marked upon the Darwin waterfront on this very plaque pictured here. In the weeks and months leading up to the bombing of Darwin in February 1942, the Japanese decided to bomb the US military base of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Now, the Americans had embargoed oil going into Japan, and so the Japanese wanted to bring the Americans to the negotiating table as a result of this attack. But it had the opposite effect. It actually brought in the Americans into the wider Second World War conflict. And the Americans only embargoed the oil because the Japanese were attacking the Chinese as of 1937. So the Japanese had to go back to the drawing board. If the Americans weren't going to supply them with oil, the next best thing was to capture and claim the Dutch East Indies, which is now referred to as Indonesia. And so over the next 3 months between December 1941 and February 1942, the Japanese made a prevailing march across the South Asian Pacific, going as far west as Burma, modern-day Myanmar, and as far south as the Timor Islands. Following the fall of Singapore, the Australians, and especially Darwin, knew that they were next on the Japanese list of targets. The Australian government gave an immediate order for the evacuation of civilians out of Darwin. A few had already voluntarily left in the weeks and months before then, but 1,500 women and children were evacuated out of Darwin and headed south. But there were still 2,000 civilians that decided to stay in the city of Darwin. But for many, it would be about 4 or 5 years before they were allowed to return home to their once prideful city, and in a much different state than when they left it. On the morning of the 19th of February 1942, there were roughly 25 seaworthy vessels out on the Darwin waterfront. Most of them were docking ships, steamers and motor vessels out on the wharf, trading and such like. But there were 7 Australian destroyers, 2 American destroyers and 1 American military transport vessel. The Deloraine had already prevented an attack some 60 kilometres off the Darwin coast alongside 4 other vessels on the 20th of January 1942. Now, the day before the bombing, on the 18th of February, the ships that I have highlighted here are the ships that had returned from Java following an unsuccessful defence against the Japanese forces. And actually, on the day of the bombing, the USS Peary, as well as 11 Kitty Hawk fighter planes, were due to leave once again from Darwin to defend the Timor Islands, but were prevented from doing so because of bad weather. At 8 a.m. on the 19th of February 1942, 2 aircraft assault teams left their respective positions bound for a bombing raid on Darwin. The first was in the Pacific Ocean and consisted of 188 aircraft. The second team consisted of only 54 aircraft and left from Sulawesi and Ambon, which is in modern-day Indonesia. At 9:15, the Japanese shot down an Australian Catalina flying boat and then crossed over Bathurst Island towards the city of Darwin. Roughly 20 minutes later, 6 Japanese Zeros splintered off from the main group and attacked the island of Bathurst, where a message was being sent out to the military personnel in Darwin. The message from Bathurst Island said of a huge flight of planes bound for Darwin. But unfortunately, when the Darwin military received this message, they sent a reply, expecting to receive a second message. But the substation in Bathurst Island had been gunned down, so they couldn't resend that second message. So the message was not given the same urgency as it was probably due. Another 20 minutes go by, and the Japanese forces have gone around the city of Darwin and passed over the township of Nunamar, just 2 kilometres south of the city. They then double back on themselves and prepare for a south-facing assault on the city of Darwin. The splinter group that had attacked Bathurst Island now made for a northerly-facing assault on the city of Darwin, intersecting with the south-facing main assault group that would drop many and numerous bombs on the Stokes Wharf, the Government House, and importantly, the Post Office. Arthur Wellington was a postal worker working at the Darwin Post Office, and he, along with a number of his co-workers, built what is said to be the safest bunker trench in all of Darwin. And he mentioned that it would be safe from anything except for a direct hit. Unfortunately, the Japanese did directly hit the postal office in Darwin, and so he, along with 8 others, were killed in the explosion. Of the bombs that hit the Government House and the rest of the city of Darwin, another 8 people were killed in the devastation, and actually most of the city was completely destroyed by the bombs dropped by the Japanese. One of the few surviving monuments in the city of Darwin was actually the cenotaph that was set up on the waterfront just after the First World War. 800 kilograms worth of bombs were dropped by the Japanese on the Stokes Wharf in Darwin. 23 of the dockers were killed immediately, with the rest of the wharf being either destroyed or in pieces. The railway that serviced The sections between the main shoreline and the wharf itself were completely mangled and in the water. The wharf was actually cut off from the main shoreline. Oil pipes ruptured and actually caught fire. At roughly 12 noon came the second assault force by the Japanese, the much smaller one. But this wasn't dedicated to the attacking of the city, but it was actually dedicated to the assault on the Royal Air Force bases, destroying the hangar bays, the aircraft, and the aerodromes, basically the overall aviation capability of the Australian Air Force. 17 men were killed in those explosions, and 12 of the Australian Wirraway aircraft were destroyed. One of the reasons why there were still aircraft in the aircraft hangar was because that these were Australian Wirraways, which had already been assessed to be completely ineffective against the Japanese Zeros, as demonstrated by a battle in Papua New Guinea, the Battle of Rabaul, in late January 1942, where the Japanese made a devastating blow on the Australian Air Force. So once the Japanese began their assault on Darwin on the 19th of February, these Wirraways and their aviators were set aside. It would be a complete suicide mission, and they would just be cannon fodder against these superior Japanese aircraft. Looking out towards the Darwin harbour, it is difficult to imagine that up until 1959, all of the ships that were either sunk or beached on that fateful day in 1942 were still present and could still be viewed from any part of the Darwin waterfront. This was the grim reminder that on that fateful day in 1942, nearly 300 people were killed in the bombing of Darwin conducted by the Japanese. But most of the deaths were not in the city of Darwin itself, but in the crews of the numerous ships that were docked in the wharf or anchored in the harbour. But the most tragic of all of these sunken ships and its casualty count was the USS Peary. One of the ship's guns is placed here at the Bicentennial Park on the Darwin coastline. It is pointed in the direction at which the USS Peary actually sank on that fateful day in 1942, and the plaque just below the gun marks the 91 lives that were killed by the sinking of this American ship. The Peary was struck by the Japanese about 5 times, causing the ship to catch fire and a number of the crew to be trapped inside the hull of the ship. As the Peary sank, with its guns still firing towards the Japanese, the ship drifted about 2 kilometres along the coastline before the fire managed to reach the main ammunitions department of the ship and fatally exploding. The USS Peary was one of about 7 ships to be sunk by the Japanese on the 19th of February. The Navy, the Barossa, the Zealandia, the Mauna Loa, the British Motorist, the Neptuna, the Meigs, and the supply hulk Keelat were the other 6 ships to be sunk by the Japanese. There were 14 other ships that were damaged in the 20-minute raid by the Japanese. Some that had to be either beached and then refloated, and others that had to be very carefully repaired thereafter. Now, the William B. Preston was actually one of the more luckier ships in the harbour. It had avoided being sunk by actually floating away, by sort of incurring its engines and going out of the area of which was being bombed by the Japanese. It had suffered a lot of damage and had had 10 casualties in the process, but it avoided being sinking because those engines were able to fire up quickly and it was able to escape the Darwin area. There were 2 ships that were docked at the Darwin wharf, the SS Barossa and the MV Neptuna. Now, the Barossa sunk fairly quickly and with no casualties, but the Neptuna was not so lucky, having been hit by a Japanese bomb in the main direct centre of the ship. Unfortunately, the cargo that the Neptuna was transporting was 100 depth charges, which, within about half an hour of being hit by the Japanese, exploded,
sending shrapnel up to 100 metres away and killing roughly 45 crew members and wharfers alike.
There were 5 medical facilities available to the people of Darwin. 1 general hospital, newly built in the late 30s, 3 military hospitals, and 1 hospital ship on the waterfront known as the HS Manunda. Unfortunately, though, none of these facilities were properly resourced. All of the resources, as well as a lot of the ammunition, was actually shipped out 2 years before to Europe to defend the British interests on the Western Front, something which, again, Curtin had advocated very strongly against. This self-reliance was starting to lack in its idealism. But despite this, some 374 patients were treated over a 2-day period since the beginning of the bombing raid. The medical teams worked non-stop to treat these patients, some 40% with serious burns. But the burns weren't necessarily caused by exploding bombs or by buildings being ablaze, although there probably were those cases as well. Most of the burn victims were caused by the oil that had been ruptured from the pipes at the wharf or had spilled out from the ships in the harbour that were catching ablaze and sitting atop of that waterline. Each of these 5 medical facilities were hit by bombs during the raid on Darwin. And the most fragile, perhaps, of these facilities, the hospital ship Manunda, suffered 76 holes to its main hull, the main body of the ship, and had 12 of its own casualties in medical staff and crewmen. But it still didn't sink as a ship, and it still managed to facilitate the medical needs of each of the other crews from different ships that had suffered more damage or had been sunk by the Japanese. And this just goes to show the sheer bravery that these medical teams in any conflict situation go through, whether it's in the thick of a battlefield situation or during a raid on a city like Darwin. In the immediate aftermath of the 19th of February, the Australians were quick to censure the true devastation that had occurred at Darwin, perhaps as a means to spur on the Australian people instead of sink them into a sense of defeatism during the Second World War. And maybe this is why the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 41 is far more well recognised than the attack on Darwin in February 42. It was, after all, the same attack force that had attacked this American airbase as had attacked this Australian city. But because of that censorship, Pearl Harbor has become this more well-known and defining moment within the Second World War narrative, whereas the bombing of Darwin has become, perhaps, a more minor chapter in this narrative. Obviously not to the Australian people, but as a sort of generalised World War II narrative. Other major impacts that occurred after the bombing of Darwin was the moving of the governmental facilities to Alice Springs, the very centre of the continent, and the military headquarters was moved further still down to the bottom of the continent in Adelaide. Meanwhile, Darwin basically became a giant military base. There were 10,000 soldiers in February 42, just before the bombing of Darwin. That slowly increased in April to 14,000, but by the end of that year, there were 60,000 soldiers based up in Darwin. Now, with 3 major points like that, what I've just described, you need a giant road to access each of these points, and quickly still. So the Stuart Highway was constructed during the latter part of the Second World War to facilitate this access that was needed between these 3 major points. The bombings on the northern coastline of Australia didn't conclude until about November 1943. But by that point, the bombings had decreased and lessened in both volume and in frequency, and were defended by the American Kitty Hawk planes. The Australians were able to counterattack the Japanese by mid-1942 and especially into 1943 as the Burma campaign progressed in a more positive direction for the Allied forces. The civilians of Darwin were not able to return to their once proud city until 1946-47, and they were housed temporarily in prefabricated buildings that had been built during the war by the military. Military presence and administration didn't conclude immediately after the civilians returned, but by 1952 things were returning to a state of normality. Things were said to be not easy, but they were looking better, and new infrastructure, facilities and services were being built over the next 10, 15, 20 years into the 1970s. But never again would the citizens of Darwin forget that day on the 19th of February 1942, when the war came to Australian shores, and that focal point in the city of Darwin and its history was created. And that concludes this video on the bombing of Darwin. Thank you for getting this far. I realize that this is quite long compared to the rest of my videos. It's been quite long for me as well. And I hope that it was a basic understanding of what happened during that day in 1942, but not so detailed that it's just mind-boggling and confusing. I hope to see you all again next week for another video on something slightly shorter and slightly different.